last time we met in a similar situation, in one of our conferences. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It was the last peace conference. David, stop.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Geopolitical Forum of JPPI. My name is Noah Slepkov. I'm a fellow here at JPPI. Today, we will focus on the future of Israel-U.S. relations following the establishment of Israel's new government. We will examine the developments that may challenge the special relationship between the countries, and in this context, we will also refer to the triangle of relations between Israel, Washington, and American Jewry. We'll open with a conversation between Ambassador Dennis Ross and Haaretz Editor-in-Chief Aluf Ben. At the end of the conversation, we will hear from two respondents, Dr. Shira Efren and Shmuel Rosner. After that, the discussion will open to the audience for questions and answers. Avi Gil, who, together with Tamir Pardo, coordinates the geopolitical department here at JPPI, will then offer some concluding remarks. Before I hand over the microphone to Aluf Ben, a few words about the speakers. Ambassador Dennis Ross, JPPI's co-chair, served as the senior political advisor to 4 American presidents. His many years of unmatched experience and expertise in our subject is the product of a rare combination, a diplomatic practitioner at the highest levels and a man of outstanding academic achievement. Aluf Ben, the editor-in-chief of the Israeli daily Haaretz, has been following and writing about foreign policy issues for many years. Just last week, he published a comprehensive overview of the history of the special relationship between Israel and the U.S. entitled Abandonment Anxiety, Will Israel Lose America? Please, Aluf.
Thank you. First of all, it's nice to see all the familiar faces from my younger days as diplomatic correspondent. And to see you, Dennis. You were an integral part of that scene back in the days. And I recall that the last time we met was in a similar situation on the stage of the last Haaretz Conference for Peace. And since then we moved to conferences on democracy, which shows the different agenda of Israelis. But now I think we reached a point where conferences on democracy might turn into conferences for historians in Israel. And the question is, are we in a crisis or approaching a crisis in the U.S.-Israeli relationship as well? We see that contrary to each and every time that I recall new or renewed prime ministers in Israel, the first order of business to Netanyahu is not the trip to Washington. On the contrary, we see a train of American visitors to Israel to prepare. Or in other words, they want to make sure that if he's coming to Washington, there would be something to talk about. Are we in a crisis?
Yeah, I would say we're not in a crisis. I would say it for a couple of reasons. One, you have a president in Biden who has a deep emotional commitment to Israel. I mean, this is the only way to describe it is it's an instinctive. It's in his guts.
I think everybody here in the room can quote the Biden quote about Golda Meir 10 times over.
I certainly can. So I mean, he has that kind of an emotional attachment to Israel. Number one. Number two, he also has a history of a relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The fact that I think you're seeing first the National Security Advisor come and then the Secretary of State come reflects the desire, A, to prepare the meeting, but also, you know, one of the things that the Prime Minister Netanyahu told President Biden after he was elected, because it's obviously in that conversation, Biden at least raised some questions about what's the direction of this government going to be. You have some people who are going to be ministers who obviously have established positions over the years that raise some concerns. And he was told, it's my government, my hands are, I'm the one who's going to be making the decisions. And I suspect that a lot of what you're seeing right now is there's a desire to get a better understanding of what this government will be doing even before the Prime Minister comes to Washington. This may be one of those visits that is where there is a much greater degree of preparation in advance than we've seen during other times. So that reflects also the American commitment, not only to know, not only to want to know what the government's policies are going to be in a number of areas, but then also to, I think, prepare the ground to work out some understandings when the Prime Minister comes. I think that's the aim.
But still, you can't ignore the difference between Blinken's, Secretary Blinken's statements about the two-state solution, and in a different phrasing from the readout of President Biden's call to Netanyahu, and the first clause in the government's guidelines and coalition agreements, which is that the Jewish people have the sole rights for the entire land of Eretz Israel and will continue construction all over the place, north, south, and especially east. How can you reconcile such
first, I would
total
say,
ignorance of the two-state solution?
No, I would say you started by talking about looking at people here who brings you back. Well, you know, I'm a veteran of multiple administrations and on both sides, and there have been lots of coalition agreements that sound a little bit like party platforms that we have with Democrats and Republicans. You also want to see how these broad principles are actually applied in practice. That's point one. I think point two, are there differences? Yes, there are differences. This administration is not going to walk away from what it believes as a necessary position of a two-state solution or a two-state outcome. This is also an administration that doesn't believe that's possible anytime soon. So what it wants to do is it wants to focus as much as it can with this Israeli government on what are the steps that would be taken that would preclude that ever as an outcome, versus is there a posture, which I think will be important for the administration, that doesn't preempt it as an option somewhere way down the road. Let's again take a step back. This is an administration that is committed to that as kind of a broad, long-term objective. It's also an administration that has not made this issue a very high priority.
No envoy. The maritime border with Lebanon received much more attention and energy from that administration than the Palestinian issue.
Right, and by the way, the person who did that is a specialist on energy, oil, natural gas, and you know, here you saw an example of crisis avoidance, crisis prevention. This was a good example of American diplomacy and statecraft. What we haven't seen is the same level of preoccupation or priority. Again, it goes back to the fact the administration doesn't believe you can achieve two states anytime soon. Now, given that, and given where this Israeli government is likely to be, it may well be you can find a meeting point between the two.
So it's crisis prevention and not closing all the doors to the future, but only some of them. But then again, from an Israeli perspective, does the world, does the American administration, does American public opinion care at all about the composition of the judicial appointment committee in Israel, or the number of members of Knesset needed to overcome any Supreme Court ruling, etc.?
You know, I think it's a really interesting question. There's no doubt that the foreign policy establishment cares. There's no doubt that I think within Washington this will be an issue. I would say within the Jewish community it will also be an issue. But I would draw a distinction here between the judicial process and who gets appointed as judges. In the United States, we know
totally
that
political.
It's a political process. Look, if I had my druthers, I would prefer it not be a political process. We now have what are perceived as Republican judges and Democratic judges, but it's not unusual in the U.S. or other democracies for that to be the way judges are selected. So I draw a complete distinction, and I would add one other issue. If you go department by department in the United States, you have a legal advisor in the Department of State. The Secretary of State is the one who appoints a legal advisor. Again, not unusual for that to be the case. That sits on one side. What sits on the other side is, do you have an independent judiciary? Meaning, do you have a judiciary that can override what are, in our case, the Congress? We have a Supreme Court that clearly can. Here, I think the issue would be if you have a narrow majority of 61. That means, in effect, that any existing government can basically override. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court does. That, I think, that has resonance, at least within the foreign policy establishment. Maybe not the U.S. public as a whole, but certainly in the Jewish community. And I say that for a reason. The reason is also, if you look at the history of U.S.-Israeli relations, shared values was a fundamental pillar of the relationship. The idea of shared interests is something that really didn't begin until the Reagan administration, where Israel was seen through a lens that had added strategic value to us. So the issue of interests and values, both are important. I think in the Jewish community in particular, the issue of shared values is very significant. And here, I think having an independent judiciary or making certain that you don't have a majoritarian kind of rule. Look, if in the end, you come up with a provision where 9 justices have to agree, and then, the Knesset cannot override them, or 67 or 70 votes are required, I think that would be seen in an acceptable light. But if it's 61, I do think there'll be a problem.
When talking about shared values, it appears that in the past 10 or 15 years, and definitely in the past 5 or 6 years, there appear to be more shared values between the Republican Party, or the way the Republican Party is developed into, and the right-wing base of Netanyahu in its various colors. And at the same time, there is no equivalent, I would say, value ties between the other camp in Israel, the no-Bibi camp, and the Democrats, who are turning away. Part of them are turning away, some of them are turning away from Israel altogether. And maybe you may use that legal reform revolution as you see, this is what they were arguing all along, that Israel was not really a democracy.
Look, the Democratic Party, I'll just say this to begin the answer to your question, because the question is it's a very important one. Because historically, Israel was an American interest, not a Democratic or Republican interest. And from my standpoint, it's in Israel's interest that remain the case. It's also in America's interest that remain the case.
But could it be the case when the political scene in America, and as in Israel and in many other parts of the world, is so divided that you cannot really even cross the aisle?
It is.
Let alone be on both sides.
No, look, it's, I was a political appointee for 4 presidents, 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents. I now joke that what that makes me is an extinct species. In the past, I literally could go to the Hill and I could work both sides of the aisle without any difficulty whatsoever. It has changed now. There used to be a very significant center in the Congress. There still is a center, but it has shrunk. And it's that center that somehow has to be preserved for this relationship as well. Now it takes a determined effort. Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he goes to the States, needs to also reach out. The administration needs to do a lot with Republicans on issues that relate to Israel and the Middle East. We've seen it, by the way, on Ukraine and on China. We've seen the ability to have a kind of consensus. I think Israel became more of a wedge issue, and we'll have to see also how the Republicans play it. Regardless, for the next 2 years, you have a Democratic president, you have a Democratic-controlled Senate, you have a Republican-controlled House, but by the narrowest of margins, and we just saw a demonstration. We saw an unprecedented, unless you go back more than 100 years, 15 votes, 15 ballots to become the Speaker of the House, meaning there is he has not only a very narrow majority, but the irony is he may have to depend on the Democrats. If a single member of the House can challenge him and raise questions about voting him out, he may depend on the Democrats to stay in the position. So, ironically, that may create interesting opportunities. The bottom line, in answer to your question, is this is an issue we have to work at, and nothing should be taken for granted. I wrote the book called Doomed to Succeed. If you go back to the last pages of the book, which I did recently, I kind of predicted some of what we're seeing. I highlighted what I saw were potential problems down the road. The book Doomed to Succeed was based on the premise that, we'll have differences, we'll have ups and downs, but there's so much that binds us. And what I added was the changes in the region add to that. The upheaval in the region, the reality that Israel fundamentally is still a democracy. But I talked about the demographic changes in the United States, the fact that by 2050 the United States becomes a majority-minority country, meaning there will be the minorities will constitute a majority, and these minority communities don't have a history of a connection to Israel. But I also said, adopt illegal legislation here, reduce the independence of the Supreme Court here. These will have an effect with the United States. And I said, and try to play the partisan issue here. All of these would contribute to raising questions about the future of the relationship.
But Netanyahu and Ron Dermer would tell you that the future of support for Israel lies with the evangelicals and the Republicans and the Orthodox Jews, and the rest would become less supportive anyway, so let's side with those who would be behind us anyway.
Well, I would have two responses to that. The Jewish community in the United States has been a strategic asset of Israel, not to be trifled with, not to be dismissed. The evangelicals do represent an important constituency for Israel, but one needs to look at the demographics there too. Younger evangelicals are not reflecting what the older evangelicals are. They are much more consistent with the younger demographic in the United States. So the notion that that's an unchanging constituency that you can always count on, you have to look at the numbers there, you have to look at the demographics, that is changing. So it brings back the notion of, in my mind anyway, of the significance of the Jewish community as a strategic asset for Israel.
But can the majority of the Jewish community, which by and large supports the Democrats, and many of them are in the progressive camp as well, could they identify with that kind of Israel as we see emerging now from that election?
Look, again, it becomes demographics. If you look at those who are 50 and older, the answer is there is an emotional attachment. There'll be questions raised, there'll be criticism, but there's also something else. We can't dismiss the rise of anti-Semitism. The growth of the populist far-right movement has created, first of all, really an explosion in the number of anti-Semitic incidents. It raises greater concerns, and it is a reminder of why Israel is so important for Jews worldwide.
That I understand, but are 30-year-old Jews do they see it as Israel as the solution or the cure for anti-Semitism, or the insurance policy against anti-Semitism?
They don't have the same attachment. They don't have the same identity. The kind of crucibles that created the relationship between the older generation of American Jewry and Israel. It's the Shoah is for them is more of an abstraction. The wars that Israel fought are distant history. They're affected by the way the media reports on this issue in America, which is increasingly focused very heavily on the Palestinians and the Palestinians as victims. They're affected by that. Look, I do a lot of, I teach at Georgetown, but in addition to teaching at Georgetown, I speak on probably do 20 campuses a year around the country. And part of it is to explain the realities of the region and the complexities of the region, the complexities of the conflict. It's clear that there's a younger demographic that has a very different set of views. Younger Jews, as a rule, simply don't have the same level of an attachment. It does require, I think, greater outreach to them. It requires, look, I said, you don't want to trifle with values, shared values either. You want to also think about those areas where progressives actually do care. If Israel, for example, could be seen as being in the forefront in leadership of responding to climate change and committing to renewables, that has some effect. But you can't diminish the Palestinian issue the way it's portrayed.
No, and also, if Israel, becomes even more climate change oriented than Sweden, which I doubt, but even then, it's not an emotional attachment in the same way that older Jews are. It's
true.
Attached.
It doesn't. I mean, you look back at what has created the emotional attachment of the older generation. It is the combination of these historical events that produced it, and so this doesn't rise the same level. On the other hand, for the younger generation, the issue of climate is a huge issue. And it's even an emotional issue. It's a mobilizing political issue. And I raise it because it can be one of the areas where Israel can present itself differently. Is it enough to counteract the others? Not necessarily, but I wouldn't dismiss it in terms of its weight.
Well, Israel has tried to do that with the LGBTQ rights in a way, but now with Noam and the ultra-Orthodox in government, it went down the drain again.
That gets back to the issue of shared values.
Which you see as fundamental.
I do see as fundamental.
For a special relationship.
The special relationship was built on that to begin with. Look, for a lot of the foreign policy establishment, it too breaks down generationally. I would date from the 1980s on, there was a change in the foreign policy establishment in terms of its view of Israel. And that's where the side of what Israel contributes to the United States in a strategic sense, why Israel is important to us in terms of a set of interests, that became much more important. You look at the progressives there are progressives who are part of the foreign policy establishment. Always, they're a minority, but their numbers are somewhat greater than they used to be. They have a very different set of views. And I think the challenge for Israel is to be mindful of what it faces, but also to recognize that shared values are such a motivating element here. And it's not just that, they're a profound argument, not to be dismissed.
Yeah, but it's very difficult to sell Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Avi Maoz to Americans, even to some Republicans, as representing shared values. And look, you can argue that with Poland we've had this constitutional change and more authoritarian rule, but at the same time it's the number one or among the top strategic partners of America in the war in Ukraine. So that Americans by and large overlook whatever Warsaw is doing to its Supreme Court or to its media or whatever.
Look, again, what it shows is I'll bring it back to every American president. every American president, maybe with the exception of Trump, will come in and say that human rights are very important. But look at someone like Jimmy Carter, for whom this was a central pillar of his foreign policy. His approach to Saudi Arabia, did it reflect any of that? No.
Well, but here Netanyahu would argue lies the opportunity side. I mean, you know, when you get old enough, you get to see and hear everything. And we all recall how Saudi Arabia was the mastermind of the energy crisis and backing Sadat before '73 and pressure against Israel for decades. And now Israeli officials are telling me that they are lobbying for Saudi Arabia in Washington,
no, look,
which, you know, you have to scratch your ears to hear it again.
Look,
that the Americans don't get it. MBS is great. He's a reformer. They need to reach out to him. They need to forget what happened to Khashoggi.
Look, I will say...
So the shared values are between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
No, well...
More than the mayor of Washington who named the street after Khashoggi.
Look, I would say two things. I was trying to make the point that every president balances between values and interests. And sometimes you tilt in the favor of interests when there's a need. You go back to when Obama gave his speech on partial parameters, May 19th, 2011, not that I never think about it, you'll find there was a sentence, by the way, that he inserted himself in the speech that made this distinction, that there will be times when our near-term interests require us to make certain adjustments in terms of our values. Look, I would say on Saudi Arabia, if someone had come to us 6 years ago and said, you're going to have a leader in Saudi Arabia who's going to make modernization the source of identity and not Wahhabism, we would have said, where do we sign up? You know, even today, he is transforming. There is a social revolution, not a political revolution, but a social revolution in Saudi Arabia that has very long-term strategic implications that are very much in America's interest and very much in Israel's interest. So when you're a leader, you have a responsibility to take that into account. There will always be judgments made about how you balance interests and values, and that's going to be true for whomever is president.
Yeah, this particular administration that's now in power is even more tilting towards interests and runs a very, very realistic foreign policy. Less lecturing.
Look, I think that's absolutely the case, and I think people would be they wouldn't understand what's going on if you didn't understand the implications and the impact of Ukraine. That has had, you know, for this president in particular, but even in the foreign policy establishment, it greatly weakened the progressive arguments, because the progressive arguments were premised on the fact that so many of the problems internationally were a function of the United States. If we just withdrew our forward military presence, you would see the problems go away. That's also true for the far right and the Republicans. They share this view. And suddenly, you know, you see Ukraine and you say, actually, that's not the way the world works. So, yes, this administration, I think, has moved.
But even there, you could make a very, very strong human rights case against Putin, and still it's back burner. The realist arguments trump it.
Right. You could have made those same arguments against Putin prior to Ukraine, right?
Yeah, but this is worse than anything we've seen in our lifetime, I guess.
Well, because look, he's trying to erase a country. Literally, he's trying to erase a country. And you know, I used to refer to Saddam Hussein as a master of miscalculation, but it turns out he's got a replacement, because every one of Putin's judgments and assumptions have been proven wrong. He thought this was an artificial country. He thought the Ukrainians would collapse like a house of cards. He thought Zelensky was a comedian and would disappear. He thought his army was very potent. He thought the Ukrainians had no capacity to resist. Turns out his army is hollow, and they fight with incredible resolve, but also they remind me in a lot of ways of what I've seen here over the years. Their adaptability, their resilience. They take American weapons and they adapt them to their circumstances. Their tactics, their operational tactics, they run circles around the Russians in almost all these categories.
How do you assess the Israeli policy towards this conflict?
It is an issue that's raised in the States. you know, look, the reality that the Russians established themselves as your neighbor on your northern border and you know, put S-400s in there, and if suddenly they turn on the radars, your freedom of action against the Iranians in Syria looks very different. I think there is an appreciation of that within the administration, but I think there's also on the Hill, you know, I think Israel needs to continue to do more of a job explaining both what it's doing with the Ukrainians and how it defines the limits within it which it's operating. Because I have found, even in my own conversations on the Hill, there isn't as much understanding there as I thought there might be for the Israeli position.
They would want to see Israel more on the side of Ukraine,
yes.
even supplying arms.
Yeah.
Which was the main, and still is the main contentious issues between Kiev and Jerusalem.
It is, although I think, you know, I think there's an understanding. Look, in Israel's case, for example, it doesn't have Iron Dome missiles to spare. It faces what are real threats, and it's not in a position where it can be turning those over. But there's a lot of, look, Israel's capacity in the area of early warning. It's, you know, it's some of its soft AI capabilities. These are things that actually, you know, they take you beyond providing a field hospital, and can be quite helpful in terms of the defense that, look, what Ukraine is facing now, every one of Putin's strategies failed, so now the strategy is basically dig in trenches on the one hand and engage in a war of attrition on the other, where you try to exhaust the Iranian public by attacking, frankly, only civilian targets, only civilian infrastructure, so they don't have electricity, they don't have water. He hopes to produce exhaustion on the one hand, and in the United States and Europe, exhaustion in terms of the high cost of sustaining this. I think it's going to prove to fail just like the other strategies have.
Yeah, but it also, from an Israeli standpoint, besides the different considerations versus Kiev and Moscow, you also have the cruciality of American support for any sustained defensive effort against a ruthless enemy.
Yeah. No, look, I think on the one hand, I think early on there was kind of a sentiment, at least here, here's another reminder of you can't really depend on anybody. On the other hand, what you've seen the U.S. do is you've seen the U.S. lead the effort, mobilize the effort that would not have happened if it was not for us, to sustain Ukraine and increasingly to give them the capabilities to fight for themselves. One thing about Israel, Israel has never said to the United States, ever, we want you to fight our battles. Quite the contrary. And in fact, it's ironically, one of the things you're hearing in the rest of this region is we know we're going to have to rely more on ourselves than the Americans. Although, still in the Gulf, you know, push comes to shove, you ask them if they really are in need, who are they going to turn to? They don't say the Chinese.
Not yet. So, to conclude on an optimistic note, what could be the opportunity? What's the opportunity side here? If you were Netanyahu and Biden preparing their meeting, what could be the opportunity side for this government with all its tough domestic agenda? And whether for the first time Netanyahu speaks openly about peace with Saudi Arabia, and it was not denied by the Saudis.
Look, I would say several things here.
And despite the very low probability, not only of a two-state solution, but even of talking about the two-state solution, even way below that, other opportunities here.
There are opportunities here, because I start with the fact, look, Prime Minister Netanyahu was largely responsible for the Abraham Accords. He's not going to allow behaviors here that are going to undermine it. And the UAE response to Ben-Gvir going to the Temple Mount was a very quick one.
Yeah, they called off his visit immediately. So
this was a signal. They value the relationship, but they also were sending a signal there are limits that will affect the relationship. So that's number one. Number two, you raise the issue of Saudi Arabia. Here again, there will be limits for them, not because they don't have, the Palestinians are not in their, to quote what MBS a couple years ago, pre-Khashoggi, when he was in the United States, and he was asked a question about the Palestinians, and at that time he said they don't rank on our top 100 priorities. I think
101 is not something.
Yeah, It's probably an exaggeration, but the truth is their focus is elsewhere, and there is, from their standpoint, there is a lot to be gained by a relationship with Israel, although what they really want is what they get from the United States, more than what they'd be asking from the Israelis. Still, there's an opportunity there, but I would focus on the larger issue, which is Iran. And the issue here, I think there's more of a potential for a meeting of the minds on Iran and more of a common strategy on Iran, precisely because of what Iran is doing to its domestic public, but also because what it's providing the Russians. That has a big effect on the administration and Biden in particular. And there's a reality here. I can easily imagine Biden saying, look, I'm prepared to do more along the lines of what you'd like to see on Iran, because we understand the nature of the threat. But also, if we're going to do that, and we're going to mobilize others, and we're going to change the climate and affect the Iranian calculus by being more successful even in terms of isolating them, we also don't need distractions. The last thing we need is for the Palestinian issue to become a major problem. So I can see some understandings based on that. And look, you have a prime minister, I go back in conversations with him a long time, I can tell you that he raised the issue of Iran with me in the early 2000s. In fact, I even remember I wrote an article back in 2006, and it was what we should do on Iran. And he actually called me, because he was so seized.
Even now he said that this is the first top national security and foreign policy priority for him. And I heard similar things from the chiefs of the military and intelligence in Israel. This is definitely their main topic.
Well,
so this could be
because it creates a strategic imperative, and that can rationalize why you say take certain steps and why you don't take others.
And definitely after Ukraine, you cannot argue that this administration is a softie or that they're withdrawing in the face of threats.
I'll tell you, one of the most interesting things, there still are things the administration has to do to reassure others in the region, but I get this all the time. You're withdrawing from the region. And I say, you know how many forces we have in the region? Close to 40,000. That hasn't changed. So, capabilities still represent something. Obviously, I know you have to be seen as being willing to use them, but still, I'm just saying, look at some of the language Biden used when he was in Saudi Arabia. He specifically said, we have security commitments, we're going to live up to them. We will not allow a vacuum to form that the Russians and Chinese could fill.
Great. Well, on that optimistic note, thank you, Dennis, for sharing these extremely interesting thoughts with us. And I hand it back to...
Thank you, Dennis and Aluf, for that fascinating conversation. I would now like to invite Dr. Shira Efron, our first respondent. Aluf, I think you're going to have to stay here. But, sorry. Dr. Shira Efron is the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Director of Policy Research at the Israel Policy Forum and a Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Previously, Shira was RAND Corporation's Research and Special Advisor on Israel. Please, 10 minutes.
Sure. Okay, I'll take time. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. It's good to be here among very close friends, especially Avi Gil, someone who I consider my most important, my closest mentor ever. And it's really an honor just responding after Dennis Ross speaking about Israel-U.S. relations, person who literally wrote the books about it. So I'll just say, I'll make a few remarks. I think you touched on most of the issues, so maybe I'll play in there. I think there's a perception among some in Israel, the Israeli left, saying, okay, well, maybe the U.S. will save us from ourselves, right? The Biden administration should really enforce those red lines. What is Blinken going to say? What's going to be the response to Ben-Gvir and others? And that's going to help us, and that's going to also help Netanyahu himself handle his ministers. You touched on it, Dennis. I mean, there are a few reasons, I think, why the Biden administration is not likely to do this. First, you mentioned Biden is really preternaturally pro-Israel. He has always been personal friendship with the prime minister, but really it's this captivation with the miracle that is Israel that really characterizes him. The second, I think that the professionals in the administration do believe, and speaking with sort of the professionals, not the politicians themselves, that believe that working behind the scenes and solving disagreements quietly is the way to go. And they cite the example of May 2021, the conflict with Gaza, Guardian of the Walls, that it really was sort of the quiet U.S. response that helped seal the operation after 11 days and not 54 days or 34 days like previously we've seen. So this is the belief. We also need to know that this administration is really busy with other issues. I mean, Aluf, you mentioned two-state solution, but they don't really think the situation is ripe for a Palestinian case. It's not just Israel, it's also Palestinian lack of governance, right? This is not the situation. And understandably, this administration is extremely busy with domestic issues, inflation, foreign policy issues, right? It's not just China, as you wrote in your article. There's Russia and North Korea, and even if we look in this region, it's Iran. And, it's not good politics to pick a fight with Israel, not when you have a Congress that's Republican and narrowly thin control of the Senate, and we are in a presidential race, and expanding this political capital on picking a fight with Israel just doesn't pay off. So why do this? So there's no incentive for this, and I think I would calibrate Israeli expectations on that, on the left. I want to touch a little bit about public opinion. It's not that public opinion is really represented in Congress and by the administration, but public opinion does matter, and I think. I saw yesterday someone sent me this unpublished poll that looked at Israel is just becoming less of an important issue, for better or worse, among Democrats, not just Jews. It's just not a top issue, whether we like it or not. Maybe it's a good thing, but it's not. It's an important ally, but responding to a question, they think that this unconditional U.S. support for Israel is just too strong. Yeah, it's important, but you don't have to be so pro-Israel and unconditional support it. And I think this is especially the case when you go to young Americans. Young Americans are becoming more progressive, more liberal, less religion, in stark contrast to the trends that we see in Israel, right? And Israel is going in the opposite direction. We see here younger people who are becoming more religious. This is demographic reasons also, right? Becoming more religious, more conservative. The very concept of a nation state, the separation of state and religion, which becomes here a much more entrenched issue, is something that young Americans just don't believe in. So even before this government, we're seeing trends just going, there is a divergence of views. And there's domestic issues, and we'll talk about in a second if Israel is really going to change domestically in the ways that these coalition agreements could tell, and this depends on the implementation. And there are foreign policy issues, and S-400 is for, like we would say in Hebrew, mitkadmim, right? This is something that not everyone would know what you're talking about. But I'm just, the people that I talk to, I mean, there's Ukraine, and you can arguably, their interests and their values, but the weight that the U.S. and this administration in particular, but not just this administration historically, the way that the U.S. puts on values is very different from the way that Israel puts on values. The interests versus values are not considered similarly. So it's on Russia, Ukraine, and it's on Saudi, as you mentioned. And we know it's not just Khashoggi. There are other issues, but it's not just, what do you want? What's the big deal? They killed a journalist. Everyone. It's not exactly that, but it's issues like NSO, right? Israel knowingly approving these things don't go unapproved, selling spyware to dictatorships that use it to pursue dissidents and activists and journalists. These are things that are on the minds of young Israelis. So we talk about the miracle and sort of the Israel that is really an expert on water and food technology and the tikkun olam and all those good things that you can see. But the sad truth is that the story of beautiful Israel is not the one that is being told, and it's not Hasbara. It has to do with actual actions that are being missed. And I think this is something that we have to know that's happening. In terms of Jewish Democrats, and most Jews are Democrats, whether we like it or not, so most Jews are at odds with this government even before it was established, because some of them are very disappointed. They were let down on issues of religious pluralism before. And you mentioned the interview, I think, the telling interview with Ron Dermer now, Minister Dermer, about prioritizing non-Jews, basically, evangelicals, because sort of we lost the Jews. So this is the starting point. And it's not just about the Palestinian issues, right? It's the very principle of Israel as a liberal democracy. This is what I'm putting the Palestinians aside. And we can some say, oh, it's the progressive is the party, but it's not progressives. So I drove in my car on Sunday morning and I hear Alan Dershowitz, in an interview to Israeli journalist, right? And Alan Dershowitz, I can't believe him saying that. He's saying if he were Israeli, he would go demonstrate, protest Saturday night because civil liberties are at risk. Abe Foxman himself warning, telling the Jerusalem Post, I don't know if you've seen this, but he's saying that it is critical that this government do not tamper with the democratic institutions and the legal systems and hurting the status of Christians and Muslims, that he would not be able to support it. And I don't know how many of you saw it, but in response to Yariv Levin's judicial reforms proposal, the Rabbinical Assembly, so it's the International Association of Conservative and Masorti Rabbis, issued a very, very severe statement. And I won't read it, it's a bit long, but they're basically saying we must do all that we can not to allow the incoming government to damage the court. Okay, so you would say, what are they interfering with our political issues, but domestic issues, but they don't see it as a domestic issue because they say that if Israel is not a democracy, we will not be able to support it. So I think this is something that we need to say. It is shifting to the way more mainstream than we've seen before. And when you look at polling, you say, you know, there are polls that show that most Jews believe that you can be pro-Israel, but you can be also critical of Israel's policies. Whether this is going to be translated into Congress and the administration and actions, I know I'll be done in a moment, that depends on many, many other things. First of all, it depends on whether this government really implements what it says it will implement. And we don't know, so I want to give it the benefit of the doubt. The first week, we've seen some things that are scary, but it also, it depends on domestic issues and the foreign policy issues. But I think the goalpost has shifted. When you see Chris Van Hollen from Maryland taking the Shireen Abu Akleh case as far as it can. This is not the squad, right? This is a different issue. In June 2020, I don't know if you remember, when annexation was on the front, you had 191 Democratic members of Congress added their names to the House letter. It was Ted Deutsch, Chakowski, Unearth. It ran the gamut between J Street and AIPAC Democrats. If this government brings back annexation in the same ways, we might see this. They could be more sophisticated now, right? It's going to be disguised as piecemeal, as improving just the lives of Jews in the West Bank. It's all bureaucratic. We're not really annexing. So it will be left to call and interpret what this actually means. But this is going to this is going to likely be transpire in actions. And I'll just say the last thing. When we're talking, Aluf, you wrote about also, I think when we talk about U.S. support to Israel, there are very different manifestations of it. But the two clear ones are sort of this unconditional protection, support for Israel in international organizations, the UN. The UN, I've advised them before, they do a lot of really good things, but there's no question it's a circus, it's not a pro-Israel, it's an anti-Israel institution. But the U.S. provides this cover and the shield because there's an understanding the situation is temporary, right? This is supposed to be temporary. And if it's temporary, we can protect it. But if it's going to be non-temporary, meaning you move the occupation of the West Bank from military to civilian, it's going to be hard for the U.S. to continue protecting Israel, and we've seen this before with 2334, but you're also hearing these voices otherwise. And I'll just say on the security assistance, and maybe this is sort of the more constructive way. We're not so much talking about the MOU now. It's going to come to an end in 2028. I think we're going to hear more and more about it. There's some to talk about conditioning support for Israel, stopping the aid, used restrictions, maybe more oversight. We're seeing growing numbers of support for this. And this is just going to come more and more of this. And I would say that if I was advising the Prime Minister, which I'm not on this issue, I think maybe it's time for Israel, for Netanyahu to do what he did in the 90s with the civilian assistance and just voluntarily start weaning Israel of the security assistance. You can shift to a different type of MOU that is more geared toward also U.S. interest, maybe in the spirit of the Jerusalem Declaration that Biden signed with Bibi when he was here, on quantum, on climate change, on pandemics, on AI, on something that serves U.S. interests also. And Israel, with a GDP of $53,000 per capita, more than Canada, more than France, it can do without it if it still can get the access to U.S. technology, but not that one. So on.
Thank you, Shira. I'd now like to invite Shmuel Rosner to make some remarks. Shmuel is a senior fellow here at JPPI and an analyst for Israel's public broadcaster, Kan News. He writes a weekly column for Ma'ariv and the Jewish Journal and is the co-founder of a fantastic data journalism website, themedad.com. He is also, if that's not enough, he's also the founder and editor of the nonfiction imprint, The Hedgehog and the Fox. Shmuel.
Thank you, Nova. Just having the ability to have both of you having to listen to me without interruption, that's good enough reason to be here. Aluf and I worked together for many years, and I spent some time in Washington when Dennis was still in office, maybe.
I was in office for a long time.
For a long time, yeah. So I'll try. Yeah, I'll try not to talk too much about the politics of the day, among other things, because I think we are today at a time in which separating the signal from the noise is just very difficult. There is a new government in Israel. There is a lot of noise, and I'm not yet sure what's going to come out of all of this. And hence, I will not talk about the judicial reform or all the other things. I'll try to look more broadly at U.S.-Israel relations and just remark on a few points. I'll begin with an article I read this morning by a wonderful man, Avi Gil. He wrote an article from Ariva. I'm not sure if you're going to mention your article, but in this article, Avi Gil recommended. You haven't read it yet. Okay, it's not bad. A good editor would make it even better, but it's not bad. So Avi recommends to the Jews of North America to get used to what Israel is rather than hope for what they want Israel to be. And I would take this argument and expand it and say, well, this is an argument that works not just for the Jews of North America, it works for all Americans. Israel is what it is. You can like it or dislike it. You can agree with it or disagree with it. You can fight for changing it, but it is what it is. And whatever is going to be the relationship between Israel and the United States in the coming years or decades, it's going to be with the real America and the real Israel. It cannot be with an imaginary Israel or a hoped for Israel. It must be with the Israel that we have. And it's far from perfect, and it's worrying in many ways. And there are many trends with which that I find worrying or troubling. But that's the country in which I live in, and I must recognize the fact that relationships between countries are the result of the societies that live in these countries. And I also must recognize the fact that societies do not change because of foreign relations. if anyone expects Israeli society or Israeli trends to be altered because of the warnings of experts about the future of Israeli-America relations, that's not going to happen. Countries tend to exhaust all possible pathways to resist outside pressure before they change as a result of outside pressure. And I would argue that Israel is probably going to continue on the trajectory that its society would like to pursue, even if that's not what Americans would like to see here. So that's my first point. Israel is Israel. Let's not hope for Israel to change because of the U.S.-Israel relations. Second point, we tend to focus, well, we sit in Israel today and we tend to focus on Israel, but America is also changing. And it is changing in many different ways, some of which are also troubling. And when we speak about U.S.-Israel relations, well, the relations between Israel and America of the 8 Obama years, or the relations of Israel and America in the 4 Donald Trump years, or the 4 Joe Biden years, or maybe 8. Who knows what's going to happen after these years? America is going through many social, religious, demographic changes. These will alter not just the character of Israel, but also the character of the United States, its ambitions, its morals, its values, and many other things that we can not yet foresee. And we must keep this in mind as we, as Israelis, look at ourselves and say, okay, how can we better behave to better fit our need for good relations with the United States? We must not forget that America is changing in parallel to the changes here, and we must consider the changes overseas as well. Point number 3, focusing on Israel and the United States is also a mistake because there is a world beyond Israel and the United States. Israel-U.S. relations are never just a result of what happens in Israel and the United States. It's a result of what happens at the larger geopolitical sphere. The relations between the U.S. and China are as important to U.S.-Israel relations as the government of Israel, and maybe even more so. You cannot imagine the history of U.S.-Israel relations without the Cold War. The Cold War was as dramatic and as influential on these relations as the values, shared values, or the governments of Israel, or the differences between administrations in the United States. The fact of the Cold War is probably one, if not the most important factor in the development of U.S.-Israel relations. And if the world is going to go through another Cold War type relations between the U.S. and China, or anything else that we can imagine in the geopolitical sphere, this is going to have huge impact on U.S.-Israel relations, disregarding the governments that are going to rule Israel in the coming years. Point number, I lost count. 4. Point number 4. So now I'm going to say something somewhat controversial, and there's a little apprehension on my part because Dennis is sitting here and he spoke eloquently about the shared values, and he wrote eloquently about the shared values in his book. Did you mention your book? You should read his book, Doomed to Succeed. So it's, I'm not trying to, I'm not going to argue with what he said, but I am going to say that the story of shared values is a nice story that we tell ourselves And to some extent, it's even true. But it is not the crucial factor in the U.S.-Israel relations. Some history was mentioned here. When President Kennedy decided to sell Israel the Hawk missiles in the early 60s, this was not because of shared values. This was because of the interest of the United States in the Middle East, because of the U.S. relations with Egypt, because of the Cold War that I already mentioned. I'm not saying shared values did not play a role, but they certainly did not play the most important or the most crucial role. So we must not forget that having shared values is a great addition to the mix. But the US and Saudi Arabia are working together without having shared values. And it's not as if I want Israel to become Saudi Arabia. Make no mistake, I would like Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state and liberal and pluralistic state. But I do not want to make the shared values as if this is a make or break thing for the US-Israel relations. We mentioned Doomed to Succeed, Dennis's book. I hope you'll forgive me for mentioning another book. There's a new book by Walter Russell Mead, which I'm sure you already read, The Ark of a Covenant. It's called. I highly recommend it, and I would like to use it by way of reminding ourselves how little we know about the future. One of the most intriguing points that Mead makes in his book, he basically argues that the most important thing the US ever did for Israel was to pass legislation against new immigrants in the 1920s. 1924, the United States is in a mood of not accepting more immigrants, Poles, Italians, Catholics, Jews. So they closed the gates. The closing of the gates, which had awful results for the Jewish people, because we know what happened later in the 30s and the 40s, also forced on the Jewish people to enhance and redouble their efforts in fulfilling the Zionist dream. America was no longer a real option for Jews. And hence the result of the most dramatic, draconic, some would say reprehensible act by the United States in the 90s ended up helping create the State of Israel in the late 40s. And I'm mentioning this story because it is important to be reminded that we know very little about the future, and we know very little about the way our actions today will influence the result of tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So this is not a call on my part for the United States to, again, act harshly against Israel in the hope that the result will be better for Israel in the future. But it is a call to refrain, or at least be careful when we voice harsh predictions for the future of the U.S.-Israel relations, when we pretend to know that trends in Israel and in the United States today are necessarily going to lead to doom, gloom, and a problematic future for the relations or for any of these two countries. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Shmuel. At this point, we'd like to open up the floor for questions, brief questions to any of the four speakers. Yes.
I'd like to ask Dennis Ross, theoretically.
Can you stand up?
Please stand up.
Or is there a mic for him?
Is
It's okay. I would like to ask Dennis Ross, which you view the United States attitude towards Israel. And the last thing I just want to say, if I'm not mistaken, Yair Levine, that's his name? Yariv may be the only Sar Mishpatim in the Western world who is not a lawyer.
Yes.
He is a lawyer?
Yes.
Are you sure?
He was the deputy head of the Israeli Bar Association.
Pardon me for my mistake. This is a mistake of many that I've made over the years.
Is this making it better or worse?
Okay.
Thank you.
Not a lawyer. She's a nurse.
Dennis, I wanted to go back to the issue of Iran, surprisingly.
I'm shocked by that, of course.
I think already in the summit it was clear that the Iranians were not going back to the JCPOA. And even if they did, at this point, it would only be weaker and shorter and, in my opinion, ineffective. And the question is that the path of Iran to a nuclear weapon threshold status is moving even faster now. Enrichment, and you know the picture very well. And the question is, in my mind, I mean, I think, you know, America and Israel will always see eye to eye on preventing Iran. But a lot of that policy has already not only been based on interest, but also on a sense of intimacy. And we need now some diplomatic framework. And there is no diplomatic framework. Do you see any trace in the American thinking at this point of a new diplomatic approach to Iran that doesn't necessarily require Iranian acceptance? And given the fact that Iran has put itself in the middle of a war in Europe in terms of supplying Russia with UAVs, I mean, isn't there an opportunity here that should be focused on?
Start?
Yeah, go ahead.
You're welcome to answer any of these, by the way. So it's look, I would say yes. That's the short answer. I say it because if you dig down and look at where things are, and you know this as well as anybody, the Iranians are going to have 16 cascades of IR-6s. These are 10 to 20 times as efficient as the centrifuges that they've had that have been the dominant part of their enrichment process. It means that, you know, they're already a threshold state. It means the breakout time is close to zero. It's true, they have to weaponize. The big difference between enrichment and weaponization is enrichment depends upon larger sites that are much easier to track. Weaponization may be more difficult to track. I think one of the issues that has to be part of the discussion between the Prime Minister and the President is, here's where they are, it's just going to continue. So what is it, what does our approach have to be to try to change the Iranian calculus? You know, the idea of getting producing a diplomatic outcome looks increasingly less likely right now. The question becomes, okay, what does it take to deter the Iranians from continuing down this path? And I mean, my own position is, unless the Iranians become much more convinced that there are limits that we will impose, unless they become much more convinced that we will act militarily, they're not going to be stopped. So, you know, the question will be, what is the U.S. prepared to do? What is Israel prepared to do? What is the U.S. prepared to do to back what Israel would do? There's a lot of room for discussion here. When the President of the United States says, we will not allow the Iranians to acquire a nuclear weapon, one has to ask the question, okay, you can see where they are. On this path, they will get there. So what does it take to stop it? I think you asked the question, where is the administration now? I think the administration, honestly, right now, is itself thinking about what it has to do that it hasn't done. That's why it's an opportunity, because you have the Prime Minister going there in a context where the administration is thinking it through. And of course, we always like to use the term action-forcing event. Well, the visit becomes an action-forcing event. The fact that you're going to have Jake Sullivan come, and then you're going to have Tony Blinken come, yes, it's to get basic understandings between the administration and this new government on a whole array of issues, but certainly this will be one of the top items. And it isn't only because it's important to this Prime Minister. It's also because it's a factor that the U.S. has to contend with. It's true, you know, look, Shira said this, the priorities of this administration in foreign policy are Ukraine, first and foremost, China, even North Korea. I mean, North Korea tries to force itself on the agenda. I mean, it's there, but these are the two big preoccupations. But what Iran is doing requires a strategy and a response. And so the visit becomes a vehicle for developing that. So yes, I do view it, it may be a strange way to say opportunity, but I do view it as a moment where something can be done. As for the first question...
No, can I rephrase it?
Please.
The question about DeSantis and Nikki Haley as possible next Republican presidents. If they're elected, are we going to see a kind of a Trump administration but without the juice, without the Twitter account and so on, less erratic? Or can we foresee the resumption of the two-state Republicans like we had in the second Bush administration and the first Bush administration, which are gone from the Republican Party as it is today, but can it come back?
You know, it's always easy when you're outside of government, and I don't mean me, I mean candidates say all sorts of things when they're candidates. You know, what would they do when they're actually in as president? It gets back to this issue of how you look at the circumstances and how they affect what your priorities are, including on issues like values and interests. I would not be so quick as Shmuel is to downplay the issue of values, because there's a self-image. There's an American self-image, and that won't go away. And we've even seen it play out in terms of what's happening. So they can come in, and Nikki Haley is more of a known quantity because she operated at the UN, you know, and the UN, as Shira said, it's not exactly a forum where you go in there and you say, gee, this is a fair-minded approach to how it deals with the Israelis. So I think that actually had a big effect on her. But again, you're called on to make policies, and then you bear the responsibility for those policies. Where will we be, should they become president, where will we be in the Middle East at that point? What will have happened? Will we have seen some kind of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Israel by that point? How does that change the context in terms of what their approach to the region would be? You know, when I said earlier that it's not a priority for the Saudis, it's also having the Temple Mount or the Haram blow up is also something that would affect them, and they know it would affect them. So, you know, the context, I think, in the end, will have an influence on what their positions will be. And so to try to say, gee, they'll simply be a replay of Trump. I'm not sure anybody can be a replay of Trump.
Elon Musk.
We have another question.
Hi, I wanted to bring the issue back to climate change, which you mentioned earlier. There's a bit of a dissonance between, I think, what Israeli public sees as the urgency of climate change and what America does. How, Aluf, you're covering, Haaretz is covering climate change wonderfully. I'm not sure what's the role of the media in changing policy here in Israel? And I'd also like to hear from Shira in terms of the security aspects of climate change and how we can really forge this as not only a value, but an interest between the two countries.
I just saw this push from the New York Times saying that the U.S. actually had more emissions in the past year than before. So the climate change problem is even worse. Look, it's not a big political issue in Israel. First and foremost, because Israel is small. And even if Israel stopped emitting any carbon dioxide forever, it's not going to save the world on itself. The Israeli politicians, with the exception of President Herzog, who has taken the lead on that, usually stay away from the issue. We do devote considerable coverage to climate change or to climate change-related issues in Haaretz. I cannot say that this has been the most popular issue with our readers. Even the most sophisticated readership in Israel cares less about it. So it's a matter of having people actually feel it, and it's still a hard sell, including to the Biden administration, as we see.
Wow, this is okay. So this is an issue where I actually advised the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the National Security Council on climate change. So I'll be more careful on this. I will say, first of all, Haaretz does cover it more than any other media outlet in Israel, and it's great. This has not been an issue in Israel, like not an issue. I think there's the perception that Israel is small. I have news for you all. Israel's not so small. It's, approaching 10 million people. It's like a middle-sized country in Europe. Emissions per capita here are higher than the global average because of our consumption habits. We all have a lot of kids, even secular Jews, right? We all have a lot of kids. Israel, it's not going to save the world. It's definitely not China, but it does have an effect. Each part, country needs to do its own thing. What's happening, and I hope this will be the trend, it was not a politically controversial issue until now, which has been a good thing. Unfortunately, with this coalition, we're seeing it becoming a more controversial issue. As we saw the son of the prime minister tweet, of course, that this is for communists and leftists, and it's not real. I hope this doesn't reflect a broader trend. We see also canceling some, tax on disposable. But the good news, so I will say, is that the national security establishment really views this as a national security issue. It's part of the national security assessment now. There's a chapter which I wrote, but I mean, it's really there. The Prime Minister Bennett put it as there's a person working now as head of a climate division in the National Security Council, the Ministry of Defense. The previous minister and his Director General started this process. Entering Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi instructed the IDF look into it. There's going to be a roadmap, maybe a climate directorate. So I think this is something that we're going to see more here in Israel. And like anything in Israel, maybe the securitization of this issue will also mean the public will pay more attention. And this is where I think, not just Leah Aron should write it, but also Amos Harel.
We have some questions. Sorry. There's a question here.
Thank you. It's actually a two-part question. First of all, I would be interested, as an Israeli peace activist of the last 20 years and an Israeli for the last 40 years, and as an environmental activist in Egypt for 4 years, where I think I saw you once at the Marriott Hotel. What are the lessons that you take away as your toughest mistakes for the future that you would wish that other people don't repeat? And secondly, coming back to environment, because you mentioned this, and here we get to the elephant in the room. I believe, Shira, that military emissions are not factored into anybody's commitments, and all of our mentality is geared towards relying on so-called security. And therefore, peace really is central. I didn't hear you talk about the occupation. You mentioned the Palestinians, but you certainly didn't sound as if you were championing the need to recognize Palestine urgently, perhaps to shake up the Israeli public, but in order that we can work together on issues of climate. So I can give you a long lecture. I'm sorry, I understand clearly you don't need it. But if you can find my questions somewhere in there, I'm grateful.
Look, on the issue of, I'll start with the issue of environment. and I won't limit it to this, there are issues that don't respect borders. So climate is one, pandemics is another. There should be all sorts of preparatory work, planning work done without respect to borders. You wrote on climate change because it's a security issue, of course. The refugee flows, as water disappears, you're going to find Israel can't be an oasis in a place that every place else is a desert and they don't have an ability to respond to it. So it absolutely is a security issue. There should be between, you have this deal that was done with the UAE effectively investing in Jordan to create solar and renewables so that Israel can then provide water. This can be a model. I would like to see something done with the Palestinians in this regard too. They have an acute need for water, especially in the West Bank. Obviously, Gaza, the situation is even worse. So there should be issues that are treated not as being not in conflict. Part of the problem is they're treated as being in conflict. Absolutely, there should be much more done here. I do a number of Track 2 efforts, one of which is actually dealing with how we marry practitioners with those who are climate specialists, meaning specialists in terms of what's happening and also how to respond to it, so that we actually begin to work across borders. I can tell you there are some NGOs already, Israeli, Palestinian NGOs that work together. All right, well, there's Echo Peace, but there's also the Arab Institute. And I've been involved with the Arab Institute in a number of projects related specifically to that. So, this needs to be a higher priority because it's in everybody's interest. Nobody has to do it as an act of sacrifice or as if this is a favor. It's not. This is very much in terms of self-interest. Look, do I want to see a two-state outcome? Yes. Do I think it's achievable anytime soon? No. Do I think that the Israeli occupation of Palestinians is a good thing for Israel? No. Do I think the Palestinians show a capacity to change anything at this point? No. One of the reasons I do a lot of Track 2 stuff is to figure out how do you change things there? How do you remake things on the Palestinian side? If tomorrow you had a very different government of Israel, would we produce a two-state outcome anytime soon? No. There has to be changes on the Palestinian side too. And the question is, how do you change the circumstances so that what isn't possible today becomes possible over time? You asked me, what would I redo? What were my biggest mistakes? My biggest mistakes, frankly, were not focusing enough on people to people. Was not focusing enough. I helped there's an annex in the interim agreement, a long annex on people to people. I actually helped to insist that it be there. And then I went back to dealing with the big issues. It was a big mistake, not because you shouldn't deal with the big issues, but because if you don't build it from the ground up, you're not going to create a context where you can do things from the top down. And the bigger mistake, in my mind, was not dealing with the leaders on both sides and sort of saying, if you want us to make a big push to resolve the big issues, we need a demonstration by you, not by you saying you're serious to us. We need a demonstration by you of you preparing your publics for the kind of hard decisions that will be made. Having a leader say to you, I'm prepared to make a hard decision, means absolutely nothing. They'll make a hard decision when they begin to prepare their public, and then they know they have to show something for it. I didn't do nearly enough in terms of that. I should have done much more on that. I should have done much more on people to people.
We have one more question.
Well, since I guess I am the only Palestinian in the room, I would like to bring again the Palestinian issue, please, if you don't mind. It's clear that under both common interest or shared values, the Palestinian issue does not come as a priority between Washington and Tel Aviv. And You have mentioned temporary. Temporary is becoming permanent. I am 50 years old. I was born in Jerusalem. I am not, until now, a citizen of at least one state. And I have been waiting for either Israelis to accept us as citizens, and then I can practice my rights, or to give me the right to self-determination, and then I will be a citizen in my own state. But both are not happening. And waiting for a Palestinian is not something that can be understood. Why should I wait, and for what should I wait? What are we waiting for? The decision should be taken in Tel Aviv or Washington. Do you want us to live in one state? We accept. Trust me, Mr. Ambassador. Most of my generation and younger would love to be Israeli citizens. Without questions, without but and if. And if you will ask me, would you recognize it as a Jewish state? I will say, if you give me equal rights, I will recognize it as a Buddhist state if you want. I don't mind. I just need rights. I need to feel that I am not living in a two-floor state where I am at the servant floor and somebody else is in the master floor. What are we waiting for? The decision is in Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C. I know we have a lot of mistakes. We are still turning to violence, and this is a wrong strategy. We are not democratic. We did not bring up our institutions. But now, today, if you will become the Palestinian president, and Mother Teresa will be your deputy, and we will be the most democratic, you will not be able to achieve anything in negotiations. So what should we wait for, and until when?
Thank you.
I would love to have a perfect answer to your question. I don't have a perfect answer to your question. What I was saying before is the following. On the Palestinian side today, I would say there needs to be a remaking of the Palestinian Authority. 80% of the Palestinian public in the West Bank believes that it's corrupt. You need to build institutions, you need to build the rule of law. You have the Palestinians in the West Bank, then you have Gaza. How are you going to resolve the issue of Hamas, which rejects the idea of any outcome? There needs to be some kind of change on the Palestinian side. There needs also to be on the Israeli side a definition of what they want as an outcome. I don't know today what Israel wants as an outcome. I know the people who say they're against two states. And when I say to them, okay, when you take two states off the table, what do you leave? Tell me what you leave. Tell me what your answer is. I don't know what that answer is today. So on the Palestinian side, I would say there needs to be a real overhaul and a remaking of the Palestinian Authority. Build institutions. You go back and you look at what Salam Fayyad was trying to do. He said, we need to be able to build what is a credible capability to be a state. That means having real institutions. That hasn't happened. Hasn't happened. So that needs to happen. On the Israeli side, I think there needs to be, in a sense, a definition of what they want, what they think they can live with. I don't know what that is today. I honestly don't. I mean, I know what I think it needs to be. My position has been two states for two peoples. I know that's not possible anytime soon. That's why I say, all right, how do you change the circumstances so what isn't possible today can become possible over time? I would do a lot of ground up, but you still need to offer, in a sense, a vision of where you want to go.
Do you want to?
No, just add that the current Israeli government
Institute, the JPPI, we look a bit differently than maybe other observers of the relations between United States and Israel. We tend to look at these relations as being run in a triangular setting, namely Jerusalem, Washington, and the Jewish community in America. We see the Jewish community of America as a very important factor, highly influential factor in the overall relations, and therefore weakening of relations between Jerusalem, between Israel and the Jewish community in America is not a blessing for these triangular relations, and it would lead, I believe, also to the weakening of relations between Israel and the United States. And therefore, the shared relations, the shared values, which were mentioned many times in this discussion, are not only being seen by the Americans, they are also very important to the Jewish community in America. And if the Jewish community sees that there is no, or there is a very serious diminishing in the shared values, also their linkage and affinity with Israel will deteriorate over time. We see it, especially in the situation with the young Jewish generation. So the shared values, in my perspective, very important factor, and I think that this is the most important difference between the relations of America and other nations. If you look at the piece that Stephen Walt, you know, the one who wrote against the Jewish lobby in 2007, he wrote a year and a half ago, so in Foreign Affairs, in Foreign Policy, he wrote an article, "It's time to end the spatial relationship with Israel. The benefits of US support no longer outweigh the costs." Now, what he proposes is, in a way, some type of Shmuel Rosner's vision. Instead, I'm quoting now Walt, not Rosner, instead of a special relationship, the United States and Israel need normal one. With a normal relationship, the United States would back Israel when it did things that are consistent with United States interests and values, and distance itself when Israel acted otherwise. Now, when Stephen Walt wants to justify his argument, he is attacking the so-called shared values. He is trying to convince his readers that Israel has different values than America. He's saying Israel may have been the only democracy in the Middle East, but it was not a liberal democracy like the United States, where all religions and races are supposed to have equal rights, consistent with Zionism core objective. Israel privileged Jews over others by conscious design. Now, if you look the way our side is defending itself, a very vivid expression is in the web page, the home page of AIPAC. They're saying, Israel embodying our values of democracy, pluralism, and the rule of law. Israel is a reliable American ally, sustained by robust judicial system, free and fair elections, and full voting rights for all its citizens. Now, it's my view, not the JPPI's view. I think that the composition of the new government and the policies they are promising to implement, and some of it we've already seen in action, I think that it would make our side, the side which want to defend the special relationship, will make the job of our side much more complex, much more difficult, and we have to focus very much our work, especially in this institute, how to see a solution to this predicament. So thank you very much for coming here. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Aluf. Thank you, Shira. and thank you, Shmuel. Goodbye.
Thank you all for coming. There's refreshments and lunch available here.